Imagine this. It's late evening. The sun is dipping behind the rooftops of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Streetlights begin to glow. A black man, dressed in plain clothes, drives slowly down the familiar streets he knows well. Not just because he lives here, but because he serves here. This isn't just any man. This is Officer Michael James, a veteran cop with over a decade of experience in law enforcement. A man who's worn the badge, taken the oath, walked the beat, and stared danger in the face to protect the people of his city. Tonight, though, he's off duty. No uniform, no patrol car, just a calm drive home after dinner with his wife and kids. Music playing low, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the console. But then, everything changes. Red and blue lights flash in his rearview mirror. At first, he's confused. Was he speeding? No. A broken taillight? Nope. A wrong turn? He knows these streets like the back of his hand. Still, he does what he's always told others to do. Stay calm. Pull over. Comply. He slows to a stop at the curb, rolls down his window, and waits. Two white officers approach his car, hands hovering a little too close to their guns. License and registration. Before reaching for anything, Officer James calmly speaks. Just so you know, I'm a police officer. Off duty. Badge is in the glove compartment. ID, too. He says this not to get out of trouble, but out of safety. It's standard procedure. Cops tell other cops who they are, especially when off duty and out of uniform. But instead of relief or mutual respect, what he sees next is chilling. Their eyes narrow. Their tone sharpens. Oh yeah, one officer scoffs. Let's see that badge. James reaches slowly, deliberately, and pulls out his department-issued ID and badge. Still, they don't back down. They question him. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you in this neighborhood? His heart sinks. He lives here. He tells them again. Shows them his ID again. Explains who he is again. But it's like they don't hear him. Or worse, they don't want to. His badge? Dismissed. His identity? Doubted. But his skin color? Noticed. Loud and clear. And in that moment, Michael James isn't a fellow officer. He's just another black man in America, being treated like a suspect, even when he's sworn to serve and protect. What should have been a 30-second stop turns into 15 minutes of interrogation, of tension, of humiliation. Neighbors peek out from behind curtains. A jogger slows to look. He feels the eyes on him, but not the respect, not the understanding, just judgment, just suspicion. Eventually, the officers let him go. No apology, no explanation. Just a curt, drive safe, and a walk back to their cruiser. But for Officer James, it wasn't over. Because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. Unless someone finally stood up and said, enough. That night, as he sat alone in his car before driving away, something inside him shifted. He was tired. Not just of being profiled, but of being silent. He had spent years defending the system. Now, he was ready to hold it accountable. And that's when he made a decision. He was going to fight back. Not with anger, not with violence, but with the law. Because if a police officer could be treated like this just for being black, what chance does an unarmed civilian have? The man behind the wheel that day wasn't a rookie. He wasn't a stranger to law enforcement. He wasn't unfamiliar with how traffic stops are supposed to work. His name was Michael James, and he was a highly respected veteran police officer, serving in a precinct just a few miles from where he was pulled over. With more than 12 years on the force, Officer James had built a reputation for being calm under pressure, fiercely loyal to his community, and committed to the principles of fairness and justice. He'd responded to everything from gang violence to domestic disputes. He'd worked long shifts, mentored new recruits, and even led community outreach programs aimed at rebuilding trust between police and civilians. In every sense, he was the kind of cop every department says they want: professional, experienced, and respected. But none of that mattered that night. He was off duty, heading home after a quiet dinner with his wife and two kids. No sirens, no uniform, just a man behind the wheel of his car, tired, content, and ready to call it a day. Until those red and blue lights lit up behind him. At first, he thought it was routine, maybe even a coincidence. He hadn't been speeding. His license and registration were up to date. His taillights were working fine. He was barely a block from home. Still, he pulled over, as he'd advised countless citizens to do, and waited calmly. But what unfolded next didn't feel routine. Two white officers approached his car with aggression in their posture and distrust in their eyes. He did what he was trained to do. Speak calmly, state your identity, and declare if you're law enforcement. I'm a police officer. I'm off duty, he told them, keeping both hands on the wheel. My badge and ID are in the glove compartment. But instead of recognition or a relaxed demeanor, the officers grew more confrontational. Step out of the car. Where are you coming from? Why are you in this neighborhood? He lived right there. This was his neighborhood. He tried to reason with them, showed his badge, gave his name, mentioned his department. None of it seemed to matter. The questions kept coming. The suspicion didn't ease. He felt less like a fellow officer and more like a suspect being profiled by strangers who didn't see him as an equal. He wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of behavior. In fact, it had happened before, not just to him, but to other black officers he knew. They'd whisper about it in locker rooms, share knowing glances during roll call, but they rarely said anything out loud. Because in law enforcement, silence is often seen as loyalty. You don't rock the boat. You don't call out your own. You just deal with it. But Officer James had reached his breaking point. I've worked too hard, followed every rule, and risked my life for this job. And still, I'm treated like I don't belong, he later said in an interview. This was no longer about one stop. It was about a pattern, one that too many refuse to acknowledge. That even black officers in uniform are sometimes viewed through a lens of suspicion, not solidarity. Michael James wasn't just angry. He was hurt, disappointed, and ready to speak truth to power. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide. This time, he was going to take a stand. Because if officers like him didn't speak up, the cycle would continue, and the next black man pulled over might not have a badge to protect him. For Officer Michael James, the decision to file a lawsuit wasn't made lightly. He'd spent years wearing the badge, showing up for his community, and following the code of silence that so often governs life behind the scenes in law enforcement. But after being humiliated on the side of the road by fellow officers who treated him like a threat instead of colleague, he knew something had to change. Not long after the incident, Officer James and his legal team filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the two officers who stopped him and against the entire police department they worked for. The allegations? Racial profiling, false detention, and violation of constitutional rights. According to the court documents, the officers involved had no legal justification for pulling him over. There was no speeding, no reckless driving, no call-in alert. Just what the lawsuit describes as unreasonable suspicion based solely on appearance. Even after Officer James clearly identified himself as a fellow law enforcement officer and presented his badge and department-issued ID, he was still treated with hostility, suspicion, and unnecessary aggression. The lawsuit argues this response was not procedural, it was personal, and that personal bias was rooted in race. James' legal team released a public statement soon after filing. Our client was targeted not because of what he did, but because of how he looked. If this can happen to a black officer with a badge, gun, and credentials, what does that say for the average black citizen with none of those protections? The story gained traction almost immediately. National news outlets picked it up. Civil rights activists shared it on social media. Hashtags like hashtag black and blue, hashtag cops profiling cops, and hashtag justice for James began trending on Twitter and Instagram. It sparked heated debates on talk shows, podcasts, and community forums. This wasn't just another lawsuit. It became a mirror reflecting a much deeper problem within American policing. That even on the inside, systemic racism can thrive. Many were shocked. Others weren't surprised at all. Black officers from across the country came forward, sharing similar stories of being pulled over, questioned, or doubted by fellow police simply for being out of uniform while black. For them, Officer James' lawsuit wasn't just brave, it was overdue. Some called it a turning point. Others called it a betrayal, accusing James of bringing shame to the badge or airing dirty laundry in public. But supporters pushed back, asking, what's more shameful, speaking up about injustice or allowing it to continue unchecked? Behind the scenes, the lawsuit rattled the department. Internal reviews were quietly launched. Officials scrambled to get ahead of the public backlash. But Officer James made it clear he wasn't backing down. He didn't want just a settlement or an apology. He wanted accountability. He wanted reform. He wanted every officer, regardless of color, to be seen for their training, their record, and their humanity, not judged by skin tone or the neighborhood they were in. He wanted to make sure that no black officer and no black citizen would have to experience what he did that night. For many watching from the sidelines, the message was clear. This wasn't just one man's fight. It was a battle for dignity, equality, and justice inside the very system designed to protect it. And Officer James was ready to take that battle all the way to court. As word of Officer Michael James' story spread, so did the outrage. What began as a local incident, one man pulled over on a quiet night, quickly became a national flashpoint. Within hours of the story hitting the news, social media exploded. People across the country, from small towns to major cities, began weighing in. Hashtags began trending. Hashtag cops profiling cops. Hashtag justice for James. Hashtag black and blue. They weren't just tweets. They were cries of support, anger, and most of all, frustration. For many, Officer James' experience wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was proof of something they'd suspected for years, that racial bias doesn't stop at the city streets. It exists deep within the system itself. Civil rights groups quickly rallied behind him. The NAACP, ACLU, and dozens of local community justice organizations released public statements condemning the incident and praising Officer James for speaking out. Even more surprisingly, some police officers, both active and retired, began to speak up. A few shared their own stories of being profiled, even while in uniform. Others described the us versus them culture that discourages officers from calling out wrongdoing, especially if it involves race. If this can happen to one of our own, a retired black sergeant said in a CNN interview, then we need to admit we've got rot inside the walls. Community leaders, pastors, activists, and even celebrities joined the conversation. For many, it felt like the case of Officer James stripped away the last excuses people had used to deny racism in law enforcement. Because this wasn't a teenager with sagging pants. This wasn't a loud protester holding a sign. This was a trained, armed, and respected police officer with a badge, credentials, and a clean record, and he was still treated like a criminal. But not everyone stood with him. Some critics pushed back, saying Officer James overreacted, that the stop was just a misunderstanding, that the officers were just doing their jobs and following protocol. You can't expect them to know he's a cop, one online commenter wrote. They have to be cautious. It's a dangerous job. Others implied that he was using race as a weapon, trying to make something bigger than it really was. But those arguments couldn't drown out the growing wave of concern, because at the heart of it all was a haunting question that echoed through the public discourse. If even a black police officer isn't safe from profiling, what hope is there for everyday black citizens? This case became a mirror, reflecting the deeper, uncomfortable truth that racism can't always be explained away by training, professionalism, or wearing a uniform. It showed that the issue isn't always what you do, but who you are, or more accurately, how you're seen. And that realization forced many people, inside and outside of law enforcement, to take a hard look at the system they believed in. Town halls were organized. Departments across the country began discussing bias training. News anchors debated the cultural implications. Podcasts ran interviews with former officers who admitted, yeah, this happens more than the public knows. But no one talks about it, not out loud. For Officer James, it was never about going viral. It was about telling the truth and forcing a conversation the system had been avoiding for far too long. And while his lawsuit was still making its way through the courts, one thing was already clear. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was everyone's wake-up call. As of today, the lawsuit filed by Officer Michael James is still ongoing. But even before a verdict is reached, its impact is already being felt far beyond the courtroom. Officer James remains on active duty, continuing to serve his community, the same community he nearly didn't make it home to that night. But now, he patrols the streets with more eyes on him, more pressure, and a greater purpose than ever before. Because this lawsuit is not just about justice for him. It's about shaking the very foundations of how law enforcement views itself and the people within it. In the wake of the national attention, city officials and police leadership have been forced to respond. The department where the incident occurred has launched an internal review. Local city councils are under pressure to pass stronger policies to prevent similar incidents. Some are calling for body camera mandates on all stops, even those involving off-duty officers. But it's not just one city responding. Police departments across the country, from California to New York, are suddenly talking about things they once swept under the rug. Internal bias, racial profiling, discrimination within the force, not just out on the streets, but inside locker rooms, precincts, and roll calls. Some departments are now exploring mandatory anti-bias training, even for veteran officers who've been in the field for decades. Others are considering anonymous internal reporting systems, where officers can report discrimination or profiling by fellow colleagues, without fear of retaliation. And all of this momentum, this conversation, this uncomfortable truth-telling, started with one stop and one man who refused to stay quiet. Officer James has been clear and unwavering from the start. He didn't file this lawsuit out of revenge. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he's tired of watching other officers of color face the same indignities in silence. "I didn't speak out for me alone," he said during a powerful interview with a national news outlet. "I spoke out for every black officer who's ever felt invisible, even with a badge. And for every black man who's been told, just comply. Just survive." James knows that change won't come easy, and it certainly won't come quickly. He's still getting backlash from strangers online, from officers in his own department, and even from people in positions of power who would rather protect the image of the force than confront the flaws within it. But James is no stranger to pressure. He's faced armed suspects, defused violent situations, walked into danger more times than he can count. And now, he's facing a different kind of danger, the risk of being ostracized by his own. Still, he presses on, because for him, true service doesn't stop when a uniform comes off. And real protection means not just standing between civilians and criminals, but also between justice and injustice, no matter where it comes from. He hopes his case will spark more than policy reviews and temporary training seminars. He wants to change the culture of law enforcement, to make it a space where officers are judged not by the color of their skin, but by their actions, integrity, and character. He dreams of a future where no officer of color has to explain their presence in a neighborhood they live in or prove their legitimacy to co-workers who should have their back. In one of the most emotional moments of his recent interview, Officer James looked straight into the camera and said, "I love my job. I love my community. But I can't protect others if I can't even be safe myself." Those words struck a chord. They echoed across social media, were quoted by activists, and even repeated by politicians debating new police oversight bills. Because in just one sentence, he captured the painful contradiction faced by many officers of color in America. They're trusted to enforce the law, but not always trusted to live under it safely. The outcome of Officer James' lawsuit is still uncertain. But one thing is clear. He's already made history by refusing to accept silence as safety and by demanding that the badge stand for something better. And now, the question remains, will the system finally listen?